name's Andrew Baines. I am the Deputy Executive Director of Museum Operations for the National Museum of the Royal Navy, and as part of that role, I am the Curator of HMS Victory. And I'm here today with Dr Ray Costello, who's an independent historian and an honorary research fellow with the University of Liverpool and author of Black Salt, Seafarers of African Descent on British Ships. And today we're going to talk about black sailors at the Battle of Trafalgar. So, Ray, I think it's fairly well known that there are 821 men in the crew of HMS Victory. I think what's probably less well known is that only just over half of them were English, and only about 3/4 of them were, if you want, British nationals, and the rest were drawn from really across the world, including a not insignificant number of sailors of African descent.
On the Victory alone, of many nationalities, there were thought to be 9 West Indians and 1 African, the African being George Ryan, who for some reason had an English-sounding name rather than an African name, which is rather like you'd expect from the West Indians, on the ground that the slave origin of West Indians, slaves had lost their names and all the trappings of their origins back in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
There were also, of the 10 Africans, ordinary seaman George Ryan is with only 22, but there was, amongst the West Indians were Jonathan Hardy, an ordinary seaman, John Francois, John Thomas, all of them in the very early 20s. And John Thomas being from Jamaica. You really don't know with West Indians and Americans and Canadians also.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, there were 22 on the Victory alone. Now, there is one notable exception in Nelson's fleet. I suspect that was the same on all of the ships, at least 10 or so, or a dozen maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's come out reasonably well. And that's HMS Bellerophon. Because it's difficult to say, the ordinary sailors always call it the Billy Ruffian. Now, the captain had an idiosyncrasy. He kept very meticulous records of nationality and race, which helps a lot. Sometimes not always, but people like me, researchers, a pretty good idea what we're looking at. For instance, of the 10 sailors that we know, we can identify on the Bellerophon from what he said, was Samuel Marlowe, a Jamaican, who he described as his race, described as Sambo. He mentions it. Now that clears up, because he's a West Indian, that clears up. It goes some way to identifying the race.
Mm-hmm.
It happens in other cases too. For instance, on the Bellerophon, David Young and Evan Lyon are described as being mustees, which is the period name for mixed race people.
Mm-hmm.
That's another one. Another one, though, that with race is given is John Hackett, who was recruited from the slave state of Maryland. Now, John Hackett was given a rather generous month's major, a bounty upon signing up of £110 a month's wages. Now, we think that this might be because the British were trying to encourage escaped slaves to join, being a bit naughty, paying them more than the But I mean, this was a problem because in 1777, Lord Young had actually had to limit the number of black sailors on British ships because there was starting to be a nuisance. And if you had too many, they were a magnet for escaped slaves in the West Indies. As they were all West Indian anyway, most of them ships, most of them were, of the Americas. They'd be a friendly port for would-be escaped slaves. And the plantocracy, the plantation owners, didn't like it.
So I think that's a point, because we've seen, haven't you, in certainly the art through the 19th century, famously there is a black seaman depicted on the bronze frieze at the base of Nelson's column. There's a black seaman depicted in the painting by Daniel Maclise of Nelson being shot. So we've got art showing us that these sailors of African origin were playing a role. We've got your research where you can go look through the crew lists and make informed assumptions and in some cases around origin in terms of race. But how do we know about what these individuals' experiences were on board the ship? Were they working side by side? And if they were, was the Royal Navy unique almost in terms of an employer or a place of work where black and white worked together as part of the same team?
Well, what I would say to that is what you do notice in the artwork, and what surprised me about the artwork is people talk about these things being hidden histories and having to research black history. They weren't hidden. If you look at any painting of the time, there's another one by Dennis Dighton as well as the Maclise, famous Maclise, which also hanged. But then the Maclise one is on the walls of the House of Lords, but although we've got a copy up in Liverpool as well.
Yes, yeah.
But you find that it wasn't hidden at all. But there are incidents that tell you a lot. But also research does tell you there is some research necessary to do this. For instance, I came across a descendant of someone, John Simmons, a Jamaican seafarer on the HMS Conqueror. Now, the HMS Conqueror is no less than the ship that Admiral Villeneuve surrendered to. So he arrives on the ship. Piped on board the ship because of his social class as well, treated well by the sailors on board, and met by Admiral Pellew. And standing there on the deck is this John Simmons, who's the ancestor of a lady, European in every respect, visibly British in every respect, now living in Grantham, the whole family living in Grantham since. John Simmons was able to claim the bounty of taking that ship, part of the bounty, his share of the bounty for that ship being taken. The enemy ship, the flagship, the French flag being taken, which is not a small feat. Now, when it comes to relationships, although there were limitations maybe in the shipboard roles that emerged when Britain was not at war, they usually found themselves in a variety of roles in the service, in the British service. But at Trafalgar, you find that they can be seen in a variety of roles. Observers of critical occasions, like John Simmons, who saw the surrender, as casualties of enemy action, as heroes in some cases, as key figures too. They were accepted in a limited sort of way, maybe, having been former slaves, some of them. But what I really would like to know about, research I've not done, is were those relationships carried on to dry land?
and we've talked about the sources that the ship has, they actually tend to be pretty dry. The lists of names and ages, and in the case of Bellerophon, race, there, but Bellerophon's unusual. In terms of understanding what actually these people's experiences were, I'm assuming you've got letters and diaries of the officer corps, because that's how we know so much about the Navy. But for the lower decks, the ratings themselves, the accounts tend to be few and far between. So did any of these people, you know, these are the 180, 190 odd people who we know were sailors of African descent, did any of them leave accounts of what their time was like in the Navy?
Very few at Trafalgar, I'll say.
Mm-hmm.
There have been others. For instance, people who left narratives, like we know Arnoldo Aquilano
Mm-hmm.
in the 7 Years' War, left copious notes of every battle he'd ever taken part in. And there are other people like Britton Hammond, or Americans who ended up in British service and so on, and others have descriptions slightly before, you know, but 10 years before Trafalgar and so on. But they're rare, shall we say. The people who had the advantage. I mean, for instance, if you were an ex-slave, the chances are you'd maybe be able to get in the Navy, but getting yourself a sort of an education is another one. There are only what we call slave narratives. In fact, they're not. Equiano was not a slave when he wrote it, and neither was Britton Hammond at the time he wrote it. But the point is, that is still being researched today.
Mm-hmm.
We're still trying to find. This is what it's all about. This is what Black history is about, really. It's not, to me, Black history is not about writing some kind of separate something. It's just filling in the gaps. I think people who are just interested in, say, the Battle of Trafalgar, find these, when I speak about them, just as interesting as any other story.
Well, Ray, I think that's been absolutely fascinating. I think you've done two really great things. You've informed us and you've talked to us a little bit about where research is at the minute and what we know. And of course, the joy with any research is it leaves an awful lot of questions that you still want to go on and answer. So that's something really exciting to look forward to. People picking up on where you've left off, and you yourself picking up and taking forward and answering some of these questions. So thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak to you too.